Welcome back. And we would like to welcome to the program His Excellency Chito Sta Romana, the Philippine Ambassador to China. Good evening from Manila, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening from Beijing.
Good to see you again, Ambassador. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you so much po.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
As we know, both advanced and emerging economies are highly connected to China's economy. And as China's back to full capacity in terms of manufacturing and business, how has the lockdown affected employment, and do we expect an effect on our Filipino workers po?
Well, the Chinese economy is now on its way to recovery, but it's quite a challenge. It's not full recovery yet. They're talking optimistically at least of 80% recovery, but the impact of the lockdown has been quite adverse on employment. There are some estimates that go up to around 70 million workers now that are unemployed or that are trying to get back to employment, and almost 500,000 medium and small-size enterprises in China that have been bankrupted by the lockdown. So it is quite a challenge for the Chinese government. However, they're relying now less on exports because of the problem of the pandemic and the worldwide market, and they're talking about relying on consumption. They have a big market, domestic market, so they're hoping that the domestic market can be the path to economic recovery. Now, when it comes to Filipinos, unfortunately, because of the lockdown, because of the fact that for so many months schools were closed, a lot of our teachers were affected in the hundreds and possibly thousands. From what we know, several hundreds lost their jobs or they're waiting to go back to their employment. Also, a number of Filipinos, at least in the hundreds, who were working in restaurants, hotels, bars, and clubs have been affected. So we have a waiting list in the Philippine Embassy and the consulates all over China of what, 300-400 plus Filipinos who now don't have jobs and who would like to go back to the Philippines. But because there are no direct flights yet, we're waiting for the resumption of direct flights to the Philippines and to arrange the repatriations of these Filipinos who lost their jobs, unfortunately. But the other Filipinos, most of the other Filipinos are now back to work. And fortunately, there is no case of a Filipino that's been infected by COVID, or there were 2 that were actually hospitalized, but they came from outside. One came from the Philippines and returned here and was detected when he arrived at the airport. Another one was a seaman, and his ship was about to dock in China, and it was detected that he was infected. But both have recovered now, so now there are no Filipinos that are being reported to be infected.
So how is our Filipino community in China? Can you give us an update, sir, Ambassador?
Yeah. Actually, the Filipino community has proven to be quite resilient, and they displayed a very good spirit of bayanihan during the time when there was a lockdown. There was mutual help, basically, contribution, by members of the Filipino community want to help those who were in Wuhan in the beginning and afterwards in the different communities, because there were quite a number of Filipino teachers and Filipino domestics and other workers that were affected. So now I think the situation has improved. Most Filipinos are back to work. The ones who lost their jobs are waiting, looking for jobs if they could. If not, they've expressed their willingness to go back to the Philippines once direct flights are resumed.
Okay, So, Ambassador, can you update us on the normal measures taking place in China right now?
Well, there are a couple of things I'd like to tell you about the situation. First, in terms of the COVID-19 battle, the cooperation between China and the Philippines, you know, as of the end of May, there were almost 40 flights from the Philippines. You know, this is like the Philippine Air Force C-130 cargo flights flying to Xiamen, to Fujian, southern China. The flights not only to Xiamen, but also to Guangzhou, to Changsha, to several Chinese cities to pick up medical supplies that are now being used in the Philippines. A lot of PPEs. There were also a lot of testing kits and testing equipment, mostly used by the DOH, but also quite a number that were purchased by the Red Cross, the Philippine Red Cross.
Yes.
And there were also quite a number of donations by the Chinese government, as well as the Chinese provinces and cities that donated to their counterpart cities in the Philippines, as well as Chinese corporations. So there was like an air bridge between China and the Philippines, and altogether almost 40 flights happened in the past 2 months. The other measures that's worth taking note, in the city of Wuhan, the Chinese government was worried about the second wave when there was another cluster, first with about 5 or 6 infections. So they decided to launch a mass testing of the whole city population. And they just completed it yesterday. Almost 10 million of those who haven't been tested in the past were subjected to anti-COVID tests. And fortunately, according to the reports, there were no detected infections, new infections. What they detected, however, were 200 cases of asymptomatic cases, you know, people who had to be observed to see if they would become symptomatic or if they would infect others. But fortunately, all that has now been completed, and it's quite a remarkable exercise in terms of mass testing. And they're now trying to do it. I think it's not the whole provincial population, but they're talking about, you know, the province that of which Wuhan is part of, Hubei, has around 60 million people. But they're talking of testing a sample of that, which would be several million, just again to see if there's been any new infections in the province. So all this is really meant to check a possible second wave as the country now tries to focus on economic recovery. Because it's really a balance, as we know in the Philippines. The Chinese have been trying to, have been on the path of economic recovery since May, and they started first with, you know, with the essential industries, the small factories, just like we're doing in the Philippines. But now they're trying more. They're reopening some schools. They're starting to reopen some museums, and traffic is back to normal in Beijing and other parts of China.
Mr. Ambassador,
So the question now is whether they can go on the smooth path of recovery. As you know, the Chinese authorities, they gave up on the target for the GDP, or the gross domestic product, for the year because of the uncertainty.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that they are not embarked on the road of economic recovery, but they're trying their best, and we'll just see what they achieve at the end of the year. But as of now, they're trying to get people back to work. As I said earlier, they're talking of 80% capacity now. They hope to achieve full utilization, but I think I'd give them another month or two because it is quite a tough challenge.
So what do you think is one significant lesson we can learn from China or in China's response to the pandemic, and how can we apply this, how we can apply this to other countries?
Well, the biggest lesson from China, but it's not so easy to apply, is that when you spot a cluster of infection, you have to contain it right away. And then you have to conduct testing and tracing. And this is how to be able to contain the virus and to cut off the transmission path. And that is basically what they have done. They were able to, that's why they had a massive, unprecedented lockdown in Wuhan, the whole city of 11 million. And then they expanded it to the whole province of 60 million for more than 70 days. And then they've lifted that lockdown and they've allowed now resumption of economic activity in Wuhan itself and in Hubei. But when they spotted small clusters again, then they did again the typical technique: contain, trace, test. And in this case, because they were afraid that it was due to asymptomatic cases, they decided on a very big medical and social experiment, the mass testing. China can do it because they have the resources. Otherwise, I think, in the case of the Philippines, the most we can aim for is really testing of a sample of the population. But to know what that sample is, you have to focus really on tracing, because it has to be focused, it has to be targeted. And the Chinese experience shows that it can be done, but it takes a lot of political will, and it takes a lot of focusing your resources on the effort.
Mr. Ambassador, how about the embassy and its operation? Are you back to 100%? Have you gone back to a 100% physical office work?
I mean, we have our staff are working, but we're still on reduced working hours. It's basically from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, because we still don't issue tourist visas. So the consular work, we don't have the long visa lines of Chinese tourists outside, because of course, obviously we're not in a position, the Philippines is not yet in a position to resume international tourism. The airports are not open yet, and there are no direct flights yet. So the consular work, basically we're focusing now on helping the OFWs. There are, as I mentioned earlier, the OFWs who lost their jobs, and we're trying to help them now and prepare them for possible repatriation to the Philippines. There are also other OFWs who, because of the lockdown, were not receiving their full wages, or were not receiving wages at all, but just living allowance. So those who have asked for help, we have extended care packages for them. I think throughout China now, it's several hundreds, upward of 500 that have been given care packages, from Northeast China all the way to South China, and then that includes also Filipinos in Western China. There's one thing here about OFWs. We have a registered population of OFWs, those who registered with the embassy and the other consulates, of only about 15,000, which is incredible, because from anecdotal evidence and from those who have called during the lockdowns, people who were not registered, it seems to be they're practically double or triple that number. And they come from all over China. Our embassy covers northern China, and there are those who have called us all the way from along the North Korean border. There are Filipinos that are teaching English, and there are also there were Filipino students from Batangas who were in a small town in Shandong in eastern China who called for help because they were, they were staying in a dormitory and they couldn't leave and they couldn't go shopping for food. So we had to extend some assistance. It is the experience also of the other consulates in China. In Xiamen right now, there's a case of almost 11 Filipino crewmen. Somehow their shipping company encountered economic problems, so they're just on a boat off the coast of Fujian, and they've been there for they said almost 3 months. But we've only recently contacted them, and we're in touch with them. They're not allowed to disembark, and they want to go home. Well, we're now talking with the Chinese authorities to allow them to disembark. The reason why they're not allowed to disembark is because the Chinese authorities are really careful about preventing any infection from coming from foreigners, and so they're kept on the boat. But if they disembark, they'll be required to undergo mandatory quarantine, and there are no direct flights from Xiamen to Manila right now. So even if they want to go home, there's no way to go home. But the owner of the boat, of the shipping company, has assured us that once direct flights are resumed, they will pay for the repatriation of these seamen. So these are assorted cases, Filipino teachers, Filipino seamen, Filipino students that have encountered problems here during the past couple of months. But there are positive stories. There is a Filipina intern who was doing very well in her internship. She started around October, but because of the COVID-19, the hotel she was working in had to close up, so she was stuck here. But finally, she was able to go home last night. She texted me as she reached the Philippines and to say that she's back there. So there are these happy stories, but there are also the sad stories. Those who lost their jobs and are waiting to be able to go home. There's also a complaint among the Filipinos, OFWs in China, because when the Department of Labor and Employment decided to give financial aid to overseas Filipino workers, those in China were not included because of some technicality. So there was a massive outcry here, and we had to tell the Dole about it. But it had something to do with the lack of a labor attaché in China. And this has something to do with the Chinese policy that they don't want to encourage. They don't actually allow the hiring of Filipino domestics in China because they don't want the competition for their local labor. They have a surplus labor here, and so English-speaking Filipino domestics prove to be quite a competition to the local domestics. And the Chinese middle classes, now that they have money, they know about what happened in Hong Kong, and they want to hire the same. The Filipino domestics who can teach their children how to speak English and take care of them and can speak English. But the problem is Chinese government still does not allow this. There are now talks, of course, and the Chinese authorities are saying they're interested in Filipino nurses and Filipino caregivers. In other words, on the higher scale of the market, but not on the lower scale, which will compete with the surplus Chinese labor market. So that's the situation here.
You also mentioned about OFWs and those who were able to go home. Now, recently our government just recommended that OFWs get their COVID-19 testing from the country of origin. That's because of the a big load of testing done upon arrival here in Manila. It was suggested by the IATF that they get tested from the country of origin. Is it being done there, Mr. Ambassador?
Actually, in China, if you want to be tested, it is possible. It is available here. So, as a matter of fact, to give you an example, recently the Chinese held their biggest political congress, the annual People's Congress, and they invited diplomats to attend. But anybody who wanted to attend, they would subject you to a test. This nuclear acid test, this is the Chinese testing. It entailed a throat swab. And so we sent representatives to attend the Congress, and they were subjected to this test. So this is what's available in China. So those who want to go home, or to give you the example of the crewman who will want to disembark from the ships, they will be also subjected to such a test. And other OFWs who will need it so that they can go home, they can go to, it is available. One can register, and one can apply for it, and one can have it so that he will have some sort of a certification when he arrives there that he's already been, that he's already tested negative in China. Because if you test positive, there's no way you can board the plane. You will be treated right away in a hospital.
All right. Thank you very much for giving us a bright and thorough picture of China and the situation there and the Filipinos over there. Thank you so much. And we'd love to have you again. We wish you continued health and safety. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.